Animation is done in a particular way using a series of animators and selectors. The difference between this kind of text animation and the previous type of text animation that you've been doing is that now you're going to be able to animate each character within a line of text independently. If you toggle open your text layer, next to the text property you'll see animate. This is going to set up an animator to animate a particular property. So the property that I'm going to animate is scale. So the way that this is going to work is that I've got an original property here, or an original value for my scale property here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a series of animations going from this property to a new property that I set using a series of selectors. Okay, so the default selector here that I have is called range selector 1. Now the scale that I'm going to animate to is going to be only on the vertical scale, so I'm going to increase that up. Okay, so the animator has been set up and I've animated the scale property, or the vertical scale property. Now let's have a look at the range selector. This is one of two types of selectors that you're going to be using. The range selector uses a start, an end, and an offset. The range is the amount of text that's currently being animated or being altered, and at the moment it's starting at 0, which means that it's starting on the left, and it's ending at 100, which means that it's ending at the right hand side. So it basically is animating or changing the properties across the entire line of text. If I change the start, you'll see that I'm pushing that range inward so that it starts now at 17% and it ends at roughly 75%. And you can see now that it's only that's what within the range that's being changed. Everything outside of the range is remaining at its original size. So this is how text animators work using the range selector. Now the offset will move that range to the left or to the right, and you can move it entirely off to the left or entirely off to the right. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the advanced section now and talk about a few more of these properties. Now at the moment the units are set on percentage. That's fine, I'm going to leave it. I could change that to index, which would work on the amount of letters outside of the range and the amount of letters inside of the range. I'll leave it on percentage. And based on characters, if it's based on words, then it's only going to increase the size of a complete word as opposed to individual letters. Change that back to characters. Now the mode is set to add, so it's everything that's within the range is going to be changed or animated. If I set that to subtract, then it's going to be everything outside of the range that's going to be affected. So I'll leave that at add. Now the shape is important in that as my properties are being changed within this range, you can specify a kind of a shape that is going to take place going into that range and then going back out of that range on the other side. Best way to describe it is just to show you. So if I change it from square to triangle, you'll see that it changes the property most in the center and then down towards the end and the start of the range in a triangular fashion. You can change that to round, you can change that to smooth. And you can also change the severity at which it gets bigger by adjusting the easing. And you can change that shape again, customize it. Okay, so the other type of, I'm going to pull that back to 0, 0, or to 0 and 100, and I'm going to change this back to square, so that everything within that range is being affected. Change that to 0. Okay. Now the other type of selector that you can use is called a Wiggly Selector. So here in my animator I can add a new property, and let's say I change the opacity, for example. Now I can make that second property also be affected within that range. I'm just going to delete that for the moment and go back to my add, and instead of a property I'm going to select a Wiggly Selector. Now Wiggly Selectors randomize motion as the property is changing, so it will change the property in a random fashion over time. So if I play this, you'll see that it's actually increasing and decreasing the Y scale in a random fashion across all of the letters. Now the mode is set to intersect, needs to be set at intersect for it to behave in this particular way. Now the max amount is the maximum amount of Y scaling, the min amount is the minimum amount of Y scaling. So as this is set to 100 for max and minus 100 for min, you'll see that it's actually scaling down below the line into negative scale values. So if I was to change that to 0, it would only ever scale down to 0. It won't even scale down to 0 in this case, but it won't go below 0 because I can't. It won't go into negative values. Again, based on characters, the wiggles per second is the amount of changes in properties that happen per second per character. And I can change that upwards to make it happen faster, or I can change it to 0 so that it creates one static range of random values on the scale and leaves them like that. The correlation is how closely these are tied together when the randomizing happens. So if I decrease that to 0 and increase the amount of wiggles again so we can see that, you'll see it becomes a little bit more random. But if I was to change the correlation up to 100, you can see that they all correlate together as they animate. Now that's the most important part of the Wiggly Selector. The rest are simply for knocking the randomizing along in terms of phase. So it's just to give a different set of random values for that particular moment in time. Okay, so that is the animator, and the animator works on changing properties from an individual value or from an original value to a new value based on whether those letters are within a range or are being affected by a Wiggly Selector. Now at the moment what we have is two selectors here working in tandem. So if I quickly show you what would happen if I bring in my range selector, you'll see the two working together. So now, because the Wiggly Selector and the range selector are working together, whatever is within the range is going to be affected by that Wiggly Selector. So you can use as many selectors as you want in tandem with each other.